If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Welcome to Considering Catholicism. We are back with Carla Niziolek. Say hi, Carla.
Hello, everyone.
If you joined us for the last episode, Carla is our expert at declaring your marriage null and void.
I don't know if I'm quite the expert, but I do journey with a few people.
That's right. She handles annulments for our parish and has been doing so for many years. And in the last episode, we talked about the various grounds for declaring a Catholic marriage null and void. It's called an annulment. It's saying that a valid sacrament of matrimony never occurred. And so, therefore, that marriage, in a sense, never really happened.
Correct.
And as we were saying, that sounds weird to non-Catholics. And I used to feel this when I was a non-Catholic. It sounds dodgy. It sounds like this is just some kind of a weird Catholic way to get a divorce, because you'll see people like, these people had 4 kids, they had a house, they had a dog, they had Christmases, they had all this stuff. And now you're just saying that they weren't really married.
Sometimes this is actually an inhibiting factor for some Catholic people to even start the annulment process, because they're like, does this invalidate my children? It doesn't. But how hard is that when you're like, I'm trying to annul your father, and
to say that your father and I were never really married.
It never really happened. Well, obviously we have our children, and like, how's my child going to look at me?
I remember how scandalous it seemed to me as a Protestant or as an evangelical, especially when you would look at prominent Catholics. Mm-hmm. So you would say, hey, here's this politician or this Catholic movie star or whatever. And this politician or this movie star had all these kids and this whole history. And then they're like, oh no, they found this new woman and they're going to now just declare that their wife of 30 years that they had 4 kids with. That never happened.
Right. And people could say, oh, are they purchasing their annulment?
Well, and it always looked scandalous. It looked kind of ridiculous. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. And in the last episode, you can go back and listen. We talked about the various grounds under which you would say, while there may have been a civil marriage, and nobody's denying that there wasn't a civil marriage. Nobody's denying that you didn't have a house and a dog and a Christmas tree and kids. The Catholic sacrament of matrimony never occurred, right?
And that is then the difference. And, that's at the end of the day, when we're looking at annulments, we're trying to bring people into right relationship with God, bring them back. And whether that's someone who is a Catholic that had a divorce and it just really wasn't a marriage. Or it's someone who's wanting to come into the Catholic Church, who is remarried and now needs to look back at a previous relationship and then look at that and go, was that a marriage or was that not a marriage? So that we can bring them in good standing. Yeah,
that's why a couple of episodes ago, Corey and I really camped on this vocabulary here. Because there's no doubt that a marriage occurred in the general sense. It was a civil marriage. It may have been even a marriage recognized in the eyes of your non-denominational church.
Correct.
Could be. But that does not mean, and what the Catholic Church is trying to determine, did it rise to the level of sacramental matrimony?
That's the important part.
Because I certainly could go get married by the Elvis impersonator in Vegas, or I could go to the country club and hire a rent-a-minister or at the ski resort or whatever, or go to Cancun and have the rent-a-minister do our wedding. And no one's denying, you got the wedding pictures. No one's denying that you had this civil marriage, but it was basically signed on a document by the courthouse. And a couple episodes ago, Corey and I were talking about how the Protestant Reformation brought this about, because with the Protestant reformers denying that marriage was a sacrament, they moved it outside of the supervision of the church to the state. And so now the civil government was guaranteeing marriages, and that has had all kinds of implications for us. So you may have had that civil marriage, but it may not have been sacramental matrimony. Now, we talked in the last episode about the various grounds by which you may declare that a valid sacrament of matrimony never occurred.
Correct.
Today, we're going to talk about the process by which you would apply for annulment. And I think that's, you talk about basically applying for a petition for it. What's the correct term?
Well, you're going to do a questionnaire, and the person who begins that process is called the petitioner.
Yeah.
And the person that they were married to will be called the respondent. And, when somebody starts this, usually, or many times, if it's a non-Catholic person, they're interested in coming into the Catholic Church, to joining the Catholic Church. And so...
Pause just a second. Let's two questions here. One, okay, first is, and you'll get into this in a minute, do you go to the Vatican, to the Office of Annulments? Do you write into or go onto the Catholic Church in America's website and to the annulment tab?
That would be really challenging. No, it's easier than that. It's right. Even easier than that.
Well, yes and no, because it begins at a parish, or it occurs at the diocese level, right?
Correct. It'll start at your parish level. Usually an RCIA or OCIA, now we're calling it, director might have a questionnaire, or you have a conversation. And they might ask, have you been previously married? And if you're remarried, they'll say, I think we need to talk about that, because that could have been a sacrament. We need to look at making that.
So this happens every day, because another one of the things that Carla does is she runs the RCIA program for our parish. And so I would imagine every RCIA or OCIA class, you have at least one person in there who is on a second marriage,
right,
wants to enter the church, and you have to determine, are you in a second marriage, which makes it essentially you're living in adultery,
right,
or can the previous marriage be annulled such that your second marriage can be recognized, right?
Right. And that's really then where it usually begins, that we'll sit down, we'll do an interview, so to speak, of what's your life been like to this point? How did you get here? What was that relationship like? And that helps me to determine, when someone comes to my office, what kind of case we're looking at. So there's the formal case for like a Catholic person that was married outside of the Catholic Church. I'm sorry, that's a lack of form case. Or there's a formal case, which might be a Catholic person who was married in the Catholic Church, but feels there are grounds that it was not a sacrament. Or somebody who was not Catholic, doesn't matter whether you're Protestant or not, but they just were not married in the Catholic Church. That's a formal case.
Okay, so let's distinguish between two kinds of annulment processes, okay? The first one, because I want to talk about the RCA thing, which is the most common thing that you deal with, and also that our listeners are probably interested in. But let's at first acknowledge that you could have a cradle Catholic, right? And they want to enter into a second marriage, right, because the first marriage ended in a divorce. Now, that divorce is a civil divorce, because the Catholic Church never issued you a divorce.
Correct.
But you have, Bob and Sally, both cradle Catholics, get married. Then one of them leaves the other for whatever reason. They get a civil divorce.
Right.
Now, Sally says that's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I've met a nice new Catholic man and we want to get married in the Catholic Church by father. And he says, well, hold on a second, because you were married to Bob before. I know, but I got divorced. But the divorce isn't something the Catholic Church recognizes. So Sally's option in that is to initiate a process of annulment to determine, based on the grounds we talked about in the last episode, whether that first marriage to Bob was valid or not. And if it was valid, then she is not free to enter into the second marriage.
Right, which can be very difficult for someone to hear.
Right. And so she has to initiate this annulment process, which we're getting into the process in a minute, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But the more common thing that probably our listeners are dealing with and that you deal with is someone that wants to enter the Catholic Church through RCIA or OCIA, and they are on a second marriage. So somewhere in their past, they were married. Now they're married again to somebody else. And they want to enter, or maybe they and their new spouse both want to enter the Catholic Church, but you've got this previous marriage.
Sometimes it's one of them has a previous, sometimes there's multiple.
They both have been married before.
And that can be a challenge.
Which means that they need two separate annulments.
They do, and we have to do them separately as well. A best case scenario is if someone was never baptized and the person they were previously married to was never baptized, and we can prove that, because that becomes a much shorter case. It's called Pauline privilege. And that is actually like a best case scenario for annulment process for someone who's not Catholic.
So there's a different, so this Pauline privilege thing is basically a different kind of case. So
different kind.
To give an analogy,
formal.
And this Pauline privilege one would be a case of, because somebody wasn't baptized, then by default, at face value, there was no Christian marriage.
Correct. With two non-baptized people.
Right. So you go back and Dave and Samantha got married before either one of them was a Christian. Neither of them had been baptized. They get married in Vegas or Cancun. Then 5 years later, they get divorced. After that, one of them finds Jesus, gets baptized, and wants to enter the Catholic Church. That previous marriage to the unbaptized, when they were both unbaptized, that becomes your easiest case.
Right. That is the easiest case for a Protestant or non-Catholic person wanting to have an annulment.
Because by definition, it was a civil marriage. By definition, it wasn't even a Christian marriage because they weren't Christians recognized by baptism. And it certainly couldn't have risen to the level of being sacramental matrimony when neither of them were Christians.
Indeed. And so that usually is the simplest case for someone in the RCIA coming in now, finding the church, wanting to be baptized.
And you're going to have more of those in the future as you have the generation who maybe has grown up outside the church. The nuns and all that.
Yeah.
But a lot of times what you're dealing with is people who were formerly Protestants or evangelicals. And so that marriage, that previous marriage that they hope to annul had some Christian part of it. It was in a Protestant church. It was in an evangelical church. It may have been at the beach in Cancun, but there was a Protestant pastor.
Right. There was some kind of Christian component that, with one of the people.
So they come to you, they're in the RCA class. They say, we want to join the Catholic Church, but one or both of us have a previous marriage. And so we need to know, are we living in adultery?
What do we do?
Well, because if are we living in adultery currently and then we can't enter the church, or can we annul this? And so they talk to you, and then what happens next?
So the next step is we would begin figuring out what kind of case they have. So what type of case? So once we figured out what type of case, formal, lack of form, legamen, Pauline privilege, I help them figure out what type of case they should be applying for. And then we get the right set of documents from our tribunal, and we begin that questionnaire application.
So you introduced a word there, the tribunal. What is the tribunal?
So the tribunal is our diocese's court of law.
Every diocese around the world has a marriage tribunal.
Correct.
And it operates under canon law, not civil law, which is church law. And so it is a court of, and essentially judges, although they are...
Right. They'll have a judiciary, vicar, a judge. They have, a whole set of people that is their full-time job.
And there is a category in the Catholic Church of canon lawyers. There are people who actually go and get a degree in canon law. And canon law goes back thousands of years, and it's very established just as is civil law. But you have this tribunal that is going to hear this case and adjudicate this case based on the Code of Canon Law.
The Code of Canon Law.
Now, that tribunal is at the diocese, but they are talking to you. Now, there are canon lawyers that make a living doing canon law, just as you would have civil lawyers or criminal lawyers, and you pay them and they handle your case just like a civil attorney.
Right. So a high profile person might choose to hire
a super high power canon lawyer because they, are super expert to try to get this done. But the average person this could become a financial burden because of the fees involved. And interestingly, Pope Francis made a change about that, didn't he?
That was back in September, I believe, of 2015, that Pope Francis made some changes to the annulment process that helped to make it affordable so that it was free and that it would not take quite as long. It used to be that you actually had to have two separate rulings, where now he brought it back to just having one ruling.
So it used to be the case that it could take years.
It could. It was sort of unbelievable how long it could take.
And there were costs and fees involved. Not anybody was trying to get rich, but you basically were paying court costs.
Right.
Essentially.
It would have been quite a bit. And so now.
So Pope Francis says, look, nobody, just because they're poor or they're, strapped for cash or whatever, should not be able to access this process. And and they should get an answer. And I remember when he did that, because he's, look, the answer may not be an answer you want. It may say, we're denying your annulment. That previous marriage was valid, and the second marriage you're in right now is basically an adulterous. But you should know that. You shouldn't have to wait 4 years to find that out.
Correct. Yeah, that's a hard one. Mm-hmm.
So Pope Francis says, look, it needs to be, in a sense, a speedy trial, and it should be a free process. So they aren't going to pay fees in it. Now, again, here's my generality, my analogy. I get arrested. They read me my rights and they say, you have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you without charge, right? Mm-hmm. And then they could give me essentially a free public defender.
Right.
And you are sort of like the free public defender because you don't have a degree in canon law.
I do not.
But you have gone through extensive training and certification, and you at the parish level are somebody who is available without cost to be like a paralegal or a public defender.
Procurator advocate.
Yeah, procurator advocates in the Catholic Church. Everything has
a name for
everything. And it has to be in Latin. But essentially, you're that free person who can
journey with that person,
process help them
figure out this path, right?
and to try to make their case, put their petition case to the tribunal. Okay, so you say, we determine what kind of case this is,
right,
and you get the appropriate forms or whatever, which stipulate what kind of evidence and things need to be. And then you go into this process of gathering the evidence, because in the last episode, we talked about grounds. So if you're going to say, hey, I was mentally incapacitated, or this guy lied, or this happened, or all the things, if you go back and listen to last episode, I mean, all those things are actually, factual claims, right? This was, there were all these impediments, or there was this diminished capacity, or there was this deceit, or there was whatever. But those are claims about things that in many cases occurred decades ago.
It could.
So we have to have evidence. You can't just say, hey, I just really want an annulment, and I totally promised that this was like, this is a judicial process, and it's going to look at evidence. So now you fill this out and you say, okay, these were the grounds based on that menu of options.
Right. So even before I start a case, I need to know that they have a formal divorce decree, because we can't even begin the case
from the civil court
until there's a formal divorce decree. So sometimes somebody's really burnt, in a bad relationship, and they're like, I just want out of this sacramentally. I want to make sure this wasn't a sacrament. And they're not even truly divorced civilly.
Yeah, they just left and they didn't go through with the civil divorce.
And so, no, we actually need to see the civil divorce decree. And that's part of the paperwork we submit to the tribunal.
Yeah, because you compile this legal file.
I do.
And it has all these documents in there. So you need that one.
We need their marriage license, their civil marriage license, divorce decree, and if they were baptized, their baptism certificates.
Okay.
Or their sacramental record if they were Catholic. So, we have to find all of these documents first.
So you've got the foundational documents, the original marriage certificate, the divorce certificate, all of these kinds of things. And then you've got their claims.
Right, their questionnaire, their
things,
their testimony on paper.
Okay, their testimony, which they claim that the following things occurred or didn't occur, which would in their view should invalidate their marriage. Now you have to gather evidence to determine whether their claims about what they say happened 20 or 30 years ago actually happened. How do you go about that?
So evidence usually comes in the form of witness statements. So once we have their testimony on paper, we have that full packet of documents put together, then we're at the point of submitting that and sending that to the tribunal.
Okay, so witness statements. So guy says, dude, I was totally drunk out of my mind, man. I was totally plastered. I didn't even know what I was doing. So what, you go back and find his best man who got him plastered at the bachelor party?
Yeah, you're looking for people who knew both spouses at the time of the wedding or even before the wedding.
Or you say, hey, this person had diminished capacity because of intoxication or psychological. Or this person was coerced.
Sure.
Or lied to.
It.
What if you say, hey, I want a divorce from my lying, cheating husband 30 years ago because he was totally deceitful to me in the engagement process and all the things we talked about last time. He told me a whole bunch of lies, and he was, running around while you were engaged, having affairs or whatever the case may be. Or he told me that he was this or that. So you got to find witnesses who can testify that he was a lying, cheating person and he lied to them. So you got to go back and find people, because he's certainly not going to sign a confession.
Yeah, he may not. Yeah. But it's sometimes surprising how the truth comes out when another person does respond. They may not even know they're doing it, but that personality or whatever those traits were, the conditions were that were there, sometimes have a way of coming out.
In that instance,
on the other person's testimony.
In that instance, woman comes in, says, I was married to this guy, 30 years ago, and he was a lying, cheating, whatever, and he lied or manipulated or he did whatever it is, all those things we talked about at the time of the wedding. Do you then find this guy and ask him to respond?
No, we don't. But what we do have to do is provide a valid contact information. So his address, whatever we can find. And that's sometimes, when a marriage has been dissolved legally for a while, that person may not have spoken to that other ex-spouse in 25 years. And so they don't even know their address or where they live. So we actually go online and get on the Google, and search it up and try to find the most recent address. And that's what we're submitting.
I remember a couple of years ago, you were telling me about a case where somebody had to get, I don't know, maybe the applicant or the petitioner paid for it, but they had to get private investigators involved to sort of track down the ex and witnesses and all that and determine what happened.
So we had a case where someone was married a very long time ago, and that person did not know the other person's new name. It was a woman who had, remarried, so we didn't know her new last name. Mm-hmm. And to try to search her up, we're using people search addresses online and really having to sort of track her down to figure out what address we can put on and would we be able to get some kind of corroboration? Now, interestingly, if someone, the petitioner is making the case, they get it all ready to go, and we send it off, and then the other person doesn't respond. Sometimes the worry is, well, is that going to hold up my case? It does not. There's a certain period of time that they have to respond, but they don't have to, and the case will still move forward. So if there is a response, even if it's maybe a negative type response, that's fine. But it's not going to stop the case or the annulment from moving forward if the respondent just makes no response, which many times is what I've seen happen. It's just that second person's, I don't want to give this my time of day. And they just sort of let that go. Okay.
But now finding those witnesses, I'm just thinking about, I've never been involved in these cases, but I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts and I watch a lot of lawyer shows on TV. So I can imagine these scenarios where you would say, well, okay, Sally wants to get her marriage to the lying, cheating ex-husband, Bob, from 30 years ago. She wants to get it annulled. So she's going to call up a couple of her good friends from the old days who will back her up.
Sure.
And so that could feel a little bit sketchy, because she's making claims and how would how is he going to determine whether these witnesses, like their testimony, that they're telling the truth?
So it's the same as any court of law. When someone makes a testimony and they sign their name, that's their truth. So we believe that those people will be writing their true thoughts, feelings of that time, of those people.
So they're signing essentially an affidavit.
They are signing an affidavit that this is what they knew to be true at that time. This is what they experienced. And that is binding, just as if someone was in a regular civil court. When you go up, put your hand on the Bible kind of thing. And this is the same type of deal, but it's in writing.
So let's suppose there were also other factual issues involved. Bob was a con man, or, Bob had previously been a monk who ran away from the monastery, right? I mean, would somebody have to go out and, determine those facts or prove those facts? But I mean, you would go, wait a minute, let's go find the monastery that he ran away from, or let's go find the criminal thing that proves that Bob was a con man because he was convicted. Like you would actually chase down all of that.
Indeed. And I've actually had cases where someone was a criminal and they weren't forthcoming with that. And then after the marriage, there was abuse and other, terrible things that happened. And she didn't know that there was all this background.
So you have to search like criminal records.
So we could even submit some criminal records as evidence, proving that, yes, indeed, this person wasn't honest about who he was. This is what he had done prior. And then it also helps to validate, the abuse that actually took place after the wedding, showing that this person was not who she thought she was marrying.
So you compile this big file, big 3-inch file or whatever, with all of these witness statements and records and documents and this whole thing. And when you feel like you've got this solid,
right,
you then submit it to the tribunal.
Yes. So we submit it to the tribunal, and then they will actually read the case, look it over. And then if they feel that it has solid grounds, then what they'll do is assign the judge and the defender and the notary. And then they send a letter back to us called the libellus. So it's sort of a crazy.
So they're going to just review this. And if they think like their first read through, this just isn't going to fly.
Super weak. It's not looking like you have the evidence you need.
Then they're just going to send it back and say,
they will.
Nope.
Yeah. And there's,
you could resubmit.
You could.
If you say, hey, if they came back and said, we think you don't have enough documents or enough records, or go try to find better evidence.
Or you're just, the testimony isn't in a way that is compelling or seems like it's all there. You just didn't have quite what you needed.
Okay. So you as their advocate then could say, all right, well, let's see if we can take a second, swing at the
second look at it.
Swing at the piñata here. We're going to go back and gather some more witness statements, some more evidence, and resubmit.
Sure. And depending on how skilled your procurator advocate is, or even if you didn't have one, you don't really know. Sometimes people get lost in the long story.
Right.
And so they're not even sure of what grounds they might have, but they're just telling a really long...
Dumping their bucket.
They're just telling a long story, and they don't even know what they're saying that, the judge is looking at going, well, there's the ground. I want you to go back and look at this
because I can imagine
tell us more about that.
Yeah, I can imagine there's so much emotion involved in this. Some people just want to vent all of their emotions, but this is a legal thing. So you want to zero in on this specific thing that would be the grounds to prove that it wasn't a valid marriage.
So when you're answering the questions in our diocese, they say, every answer should either be, it could be as simple as a yes or no, but no longer than about 4 sentences. Yeah. Because it's not about telling, okay, and then this happened, and then she did this, and I said this. No, that's not what we're looking for.
Yeah, because you're zeroing in on this very specific legal canon law question.
Right.
Did the ground, to support the grounds that this was an invalid marriage. Okay. Now, let's suppose that they review it and they say, it looks like prima facie, you've got a case that we can now take to the next step. And they send you this document.
It's called the libellus. And so they will send this to the petitioner, and then they also will cite the respondent. So the other spouse, the ex-spouse.
Yeah, the ex-spouse.
And then the respondents will be asked to reply within 3 weeks. But if they don't, again, that won't stop the case, but they do have 3 weeks to
So they could say, wait a minute, I object to this based on XYZ. Like my ex here is applying for this and this whole thing that she's claiming, like I dispute the facts.
They could do that. But once we receive the libellus, we will have that signed, and it has to be notarized or signed by a parish priest. And then that gets sent back in, and that's when the case formally begins. So I think sometimes people think, okay, when I start my paperwork and I'm working with my advocate, that's when it began. Well, it really doesn't begin, like the clock doesn't begin until the libellus is accepted, or you get that letter until the case is accepted. And then that's when it officially begins. So if you are looking at a formal case in our Diocese of Grand Rapids in Michigan, then you're probably looking at about a 12 to 14 month process from that point. From
the time that they initiate. So not all that pre-work.
That didn't count in the time.
Pre-work could have taken you 6 months.
It could have. And some people are working through a lot of trauma with recalling these details if it was a really nasty marriage. And so, it can be very healing to let those things go and to work that out. But yeah, whatever time it took ahead of the libellus doesn't count on the clock. This is when the formal clock begins.
Okay. So now they've appointed a judge, right? A member of the tribunal who will be like the presiding judge, so to speak. Now, this is the part where people get freaked out because they go, so do I go to this tribunal like a courthouse or a big hearing room where there's going to be this big panel of judges there and I sit in a chair and they grill me about my marriage?
Thankfully, no. No, your testimony for the petitioner is all in writing. So you should not need to go to the tribunal. Now, in rare instances, you might be asked to come and have a conversation, but for the most part, no. Once that case is accepted, it's all on paper. Likewise, if they didn't hear from the respondent, they'll recite the respondent. He'll have, he or she would have so many weeks to respond. And then we start moving into the witness statements of the witnesses, being mailed their questionnaires. And that is actually the point where I always say to my petitioners, okay, as we know that's about to occur, reach out to your witnesses, make sure they know what's coming, make sure they get right on it, because that's one of the parts of the case that can actually hold it up is when, they said, this is going to be my witness. And then that person's, I just didn't feel like doing it. And now your case is stuck. So, and those are your people. So, you have to let your people know, hey, I really need you to, fill that out. I'm not going to tell you what to say. Just fill it out and get that back into tribunal. And that will help things to continue to move forward.
So from the time that they begin, it could take them a year or more to actually go through and do this because they're handling, I guess, multiple cases, but also then they're thoroughly going through these things. And I imagine the members of the tribunal are going back and asking these other questions or whatever. So over this process of them examining this, in a sense, it's like a trial, but it's a trial that all occurs not necessarily on paper, but it's all done through these kinds of paperwork processes, not really going and sitting in a hearing room or something.
Correct. Yeah. So, some people have that misconception.
Well, it's probably intimidating. I thought that, someone's going to sit there and stand up some panel of, 9 guys who are going to sit up there and grill you and all that. That's not what happens.
Yeah. So after all those witness statements are in and say the respondent has had their time to respond and everything comes in, then we're at the point of publishing the decree of conclusion. And then from there, it's going to be sent to the defender of the bond. So interestingly, this person's role is to sort of be like the devil's advocate. Did the bond actually occur? Like I'm standing up that the sacrament could have occurred. So this person's really arguing in favor of the validity of the sacrament.
So the tribunal says we're inclined to decide in favor of the annulment.
So they give it that chance, right? It gets sent to the defender of the bond.
And then they send it to this guy who plays the devil's advocate to challenge it, to just really, really, push on
really
this.
Look at all the details
and see. And his job is to find any loopholes or chinks in the armor. So he's trying to knock it back down and say, I want to deny the annulment. Because really what you're trying to do here is have this almost peer-reviewed process where you're going to come out and go, this was really, really examined from all angles and pushed on so that the church can say no valid marriage or no valid sacrament of matrimony.
We want to know for sure there was no sacrament here. And then once that defender concludes their review, it will go back to the diocese, to the judge for sentencing.
And then he pronounces the outcome.
Right. Yeah. He'll make his decision and then everyone will be notified of the decision. And now, in our diocese, before it would go to the defender of the bond, as we're reading the case at the beginning and the witness statements come in, it will be read. And at that time, again, if they feel like it's not, fully formed,
it's a weak case.
They may send it back to us to rework or to look at. But if it's made it all the way to the defender of the bond, we're pretty confident that this case is this is not.
Yeah, you and I were talking about that earlier today. So it's weird because they'll look at the percentage of cases that the tribunal adjudicates, and it's almost 100% of them it decides in favor of the annulment, because by the time it has gotten to that point in the process,
of the ruling,
they've weeded out all of the bad cases. The weak cases never sort of get to that.
Because it's sort of like a double jeopardy thing. Once you've gone for one specific ground, if you didn't actually have enough to say, yes, it actually is definitely annulled or annullable.
So there's no appeal.
You can't appeal it. So they're going to pull the case before they're going to allow it to go through to judgment.
And so from that first time that you walk into the parish office and say, I want to start this process, you're weeding out bad cases through the investigative process, through everything else, all the witness statements, so that the reality is if there's 100 people that want an annulment, only a certain percentage of those are going to get to the point where it's in front of the tribunal.
Right.
But by the time it gets there, it's probably a really solid case.
Yeah. But when they accept the case, it's pretty solid there. And they could come back later and ask, for some more details, which can definitely happen. But by the time we've made it all the way to the defender of the bond, we're pretty certain that we have a very solid case.
But it still could, they still could rule negatively, and there is no appeal. There's no double, it's like a double jeopardy, as you say.
Yeah. So the only objection that you can have is to take it to Rome. So
there is an appeal.
If the, parties object to the ruling, then you can appeal to Rome after the ruling.
So
So say it didn't go your way.
It's like going to the Supreme Court.
Then you could appeal it to Rome. And of course, that process is
really long.
That's really where it gets long. Yeah.
Because those cases are coming from all around the world. And I imagine they then weed out.
Just look to see if there's merit.
Like this, like the Supreme Court. I mean, everybody would take their case to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court doesn't agree to hear all cases.
Right.
So Rome may not even hey, there's
their canon lawyers would look at it and they would decide whether
the diocese got it
right off the bat. Yeah.
So
yeah, and so then finally, we will get a letter notifying that the annulment was granted. We can add this to a sacrament record if they're Catholic. We can give this to maybe a non-Catholic person and say, this may free you to marry in the church. Interestingly, there can be sanctions put onto someone that may mean that they need to do maybe counseling or, they need to have some help before they're going to be open to be able to be married.
Okay, so you might say, we annul the marriage, but we don't give you the green light to enter the second marriage until you go through some healing or some other things. Because we agree that the first marriage wasn't valid, but you've got some brokenness before you would enter into a new one.
And we just want to make sure that people are entering a real marriage and that they're doing it freely and they know what they're doing and that they have the capacity to enter that marriage fully.
Well, the church has been dealing with this for thousands of years. So this is a long, historically complex thing. And we're skimming the surface here. But this has been really helpful, I think, maybe for people to understand just a little bit what's involved, because there aren't a lot of TV shows.
No, you can't learn about this on TV, can
we? No, not really. So, Carla, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us about the grounds for annulments and the process for annulments. And I know that this is something that deserves a lot of prayer because it's dealing with the substance of people's lives. And maybe a conversation for another time is, what about those people who want to enter the church and don't get the answer they want? And maybe that's a pastoral conversation for another time. But we're going to wrap it for today. Hey, thank you again for joining us for this episode. As always, please rate and review the podcast. That really helps us with searches, as does follow or subscribe. Whatever podcast platform you're on, there'll be a follow or subscribe button. Make sure you do that. And go to our website, consideringcatholicism.com. You can see all of the episodes there, categorized and searchable by topic. You can also leave a message there. You can also write me an email at consideringcatholicism.com. I'd love to hear your stories, love your questions. And while you're there, would you consider supporting this ministry? You can give a one-time or recurring gift, which allows us to sustain this and even grow it so that more people can consider Catholicism. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you or having you hear us in the next episode. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks.